Watch this.
They may not be the first to remove books, but they may have done it the most since Idaho's library law went into effect. We check into what happened at Eagles Library.
Do our elected officials represent our views?
If they're elected in a closed primary, probably not, at least not for most of us. In our second look at Idaho's Prop 1, an historical take on open or closed primaries in Idaho.
We are trying to be really intentional about how do we use this space in a way that, again, sort of furthers the learning and deepens understanding without sensationalizing.
There's a new powerful portal into the past, and it's opening tomorrow at the Wassmuth Center for Human Rights. Probably the most contentious question on Idaho's November general election ballot, other than who's going to lead the country for the next 4 years, will be how the Gem State selects its state and county leaders. Proposition 1 would repeal Idaho's allowance of closed party primaries. It would instead install an open primary, a blanket primary, where the top 4 vote getters, regardless of affiliation, would advance to the November general election. Who ultimately wins that race or that election, the general election, would then be determined by ranked choice voting. Prop 1, if passed, and stop me if you've heard this before, would fundamentally change Idaho's elections. Supporters say it's about time, but opponents claim it would fracture our democratic foundation. But it's not like this would be the first time Idaho's elections fundamentally changed. On the first Saturday of June in 2007, the Idaho GOP gathered in Burley for their annual summer meeting. And that day, in a vote that would split the party, the Idaho Republican Central Committee passed a rule to close its primary election, which had been wide open since the early 1970s. Now, going into that weekend, even the party chair at the time questioned its necessity. My first question, what is broken? Kirk Sullivan told the Associated Press, pointing to the fact 79 of 105 lawmakers and all the state elected positions were filled with Republicans at the time. Why do we need to change the rules? Sullivan asked. Well, in today's look into Prop 1 and the history of open and closed primaries in Idaho, we're starting where it all started, in June of 2007.
Richard Slack has voted.
For more than 35 years, Idaho has had open primary elections in which voters can cast ballots for whomever they want, irrespective of their party affiliation. But some Republicans want to change that. Members of the GOP's Central Committee voted over the weekend to close the Republican primaries, meaning you would need to be a registered member of that party in order to vote, something that has never happened in Idaho's history. It is a controversial move, which many fear will disenfranchise independent voters. In fact, many of Idaho's top Republicans oppose the change, including Senator Larry Craig, Governor Butch Otter, the Secretary of State, and the Republican Party's own chairman. But the majority of those in the Central Committee voted to the contrary.
If you're going to be a Republican and vote in the Republican primary, you need to be a member of the Republican Party.
Might this alienate some of those independents, of which there are believed to be quite a few in Idaho, that they might then just go to the Democrats?
I don't think so. I think the Republican Party is stronger than it's ever been, and I think we will continue that trend.
Well, I don't think it's good for the state.
Keith Allred is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and a fifth-generation Idahoan. He says it's well documented that closed primaries produce candidates with more extreme views, be they Republican or Democratic.
Whether you're conservative or liberal, we all have an interest in our government being representative of who we are as Idahoans. Closed primaries give you less representative winners. They represent less well the broad swath of Idahoans and will represent more one wing of one party. And I just don't think that can be good for the state.
A sentiment echoed by Idaho Democrats.
But I think this is one in a series of events that will change Idaho politics. There's going to be a real fight in the Republican Party for control of the center.
First, though, change has to be implemented, and just when and how that happens is a bit ambiguous at this point. Since party rule trumps state law, Republicans will most likely sue the Secretary of State to get the primary process changed. A U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2000 sets the precedent and paves the way for such action. But then there's the issue of getting voters to register with their party. How does the state manage that with 700,000 registered voters? And one of the biggest questions, what happens to independence? Allison Uten, Idaho's News Channel 7.
At the time, there weren't any solid answers to the questions. How does the state manage the registration? And what about independent, unaffiliated voters? As for the fight for the central part of that party, they kind of kicked that to the curb, haven't they? Well, they would have years to figure out those other questions that Allison brought up in 2007. In 2000, as she mentioned, U.S. Supreme Court had already ruled it was legal for parties to close their primaries. So Idaho's GOP was, well, where they were hoping to have it done by 2010. However, it would take a couple of lawsuits and a legislative session to open Idaho to close primaries. There was the initial lawsuit in 2007, which was dismissed because plaintiff Rod Beck didn't have the standing to sue the Secretary of State, Ben Usursa. Then a new lawsuit was filed in 2008, this time by the whole state Republican Party. That lawsuit was finally decided in March of 2011 by a district court, a federal district court, with Judge Windmill ruling Idaho's open primary rule violated the GOP's First Amendment rights. The ruling came just in time for lawmakers to then pass House Bill 351 on the second to last day of that session, which would allow parties to close primaries. That also, which the Republican Party did, I guess, for the May primary of 2012. Well, then came the Open Primaries Initiative of 2024, with Reclaim Idaho turning in more than enough signatures to get Prop 1 on the November ballot. The reason, they say, to open up Idaho's elective process to the nearly 300,000 unaffiliated voters in Idaho, unable to vote in a closed primary. The Democratic Party currently in Idaho, the only open primary in the state. In that story from 2007, we heard from Keith Allred, at the time a fifth-generation Idahoan, still is, and he was then a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Well, now Allred said then closed primaries produce candidates with more extreme views, be they Republican or Democratic, didn't matter. Today, Allred is the executive director for the National Institute for Civil Discourse. He's been in Washington, D.C. for the past 6 years, but he's been watching what has been happening in politics in his home state. So what has he noticed since 2007?
Well, Idaho really reflects national trends, and that is that the extremes are gaining more and more control, and that makes it really tough in our system. The founders purposely created a system that would make it virtually impossible to pass things on purely partisan bases. But now, whether it's the Idaho legislature or any other state legislature or the American Congress, the members of both parties are ever more intent on just trying to impose their will on everyone else.
Do you stand by kind of what you said back in 2007? Whether you're conservative or liberal, we all have an interest in our government being representative
of who we are as Idahoans. Closed primaries give you less representative winners. They represent less well the broad swath of Idahoans and will represent more one wing of one party. And I just don't think that can be good for the state.
Yeah, the evidence is much stronger now than it was then. So it's even truer now than what I said then. It's been very interesting to see. There's just much more research on this in 2024 than there was in 2007. Closed primaries tend to play to the extreme wings of both parties, and it's ironic, Brian, both parties, it's one thing they can agree on is they oppose these kinds of initiatives because they fear it will take away their power and, those that are beholden to the extremes.
There's been a lot of confusion, and you can thank the Republicans for the confusion.
Since 2012,
the Republicans are the only party choosing to close their election to just Republicans.
We invite all like-minded Idahoans to join us in our party selection process, to affiliate as a Republican and have a say in who our nominee will be for the November elections.
There are still a lot of people in Idaho who don't want to be affiliated with a party, any party. We pride ourselves on being independent.
Just looking at the numbers doesn't tell the whole story, according to Allred. It was January 2014. Now, the primaries had already been in play, but at that point, 60% of the registered voters in Idaho were independent or unaffiliated. And today, it is 60% Republican, 13% Democrat, 27% independent or unaffiliated. What does that tell you?
Well, that's not a very accurate measure of people's true feelings because you can only participate in the Republican primary if you register. And so that first number is far more representative of where people really are. And it kind of points to one of the criticisms of these kinds of primary systems is that it really doesn't treat independents fairly. The particulars really matter. So you have simply closed primaries, but there's a lot of different versions of open primaries, and those details tend to matter. And from what we know of from the evidence so far, the version that Idaho has picked is the most promising version that has been tried.
How so? What do you mean when you say promising that has been tried? How is it the most promising?
Well, that it is the most effective at producing winners that are the most representative of everybody in the state. The reason these come about is because people recognize that we're not getting representatives that really represent the full voice of Idahoans.
Okay, so what about that full voice of Idahoans? Does the current system of a closed primary represent all of Idaho voters or just the extreme factions? So let's take a look at the big picture first. Last year, Unite America Institute published a study. They're a nonpartisan nonprofit trying to figure out what the root cause of our political polarity might be. That study, based on a Gallup poll done once a month for the past 20 years, they said independents are the largest voting bloc in America. And that group went from 31% in 2004 to 49% in 2023, meaning in the nearly 24 states with a closed party primary, 10 are red states, 9 are blue states, and there are 3 swing states in the middle. In those states, 27 million independent voters are disenfranchised and denied the right for full Democratic participation in places with closed primaries. In Idaho, that accounts for nearly 300,000. That would be 28% of registered voters. And you may not think that's a lot compared to the big picture of more than 1 million registered voters in Idaho. But when you consider how much has changed since 2014, when independents and unaffiliated, as we talked about with Keith Allred, they accounted for 60% of registered Idahoans. Republicans only 32% in 2014. The state GOP points to their success, this kind of swing the other way, as the supermajority party. Others, like Allred, claim those registration rolls swelled these past dozen years because in most places in Idaho, the election is won in the Republican primary. We've talked about this many times. So in order to have a say, many people have just capitulated and joined the Republican Party. Maybe that's the reason. Open or closed primaries split the Republican Party in 2007, and it's doing that again in 2024. As you may have noticed, with their legally questionable social media videos, the current GOP leadership, including Idaho's current governor, well, they oppose Prop 1, but there are many Republicans in favor of it, including Governor Little's predecessor, Butch Otter, who was opposed to closing the primary in 2007, and former Speaker of the House, Bruce Newcomb. Idaho voters will decide for themselves to either close or crack them open in 27 days. Well, nearly 2 years ago, almost exactly, construction began on the Wassmuth Center's new education building, named for the late Governor Phil Batt. Tomorrow, the public will be able to see inside that building for the first time. Well, Joe Paris got a look inside today and explains how technology will make the Phil Batt Education Building not just a community event center, but the center for critical conversations on human rights.
For more than 2 decades, the Wassmuth Center for Human Rights has been a centerpiece for conversations about civil liberties. And now that work is expanding right next to another impactful monument in Boise, the Idaho Anne Frank Human Rights Memorial.
We're sitting in our new classroom in our new building.
Christina Bruce Benyon is the executive director of the Wassmuth Center.
We've never had really a space to both house the staff as well as offer programs and house sort of the resources that we have. So the building was really the hope and the dream to have that space and to have it work out to be adjacent to the memorial so that the work really remains seamless and sort of the ideas and the messages just continue to flow and build on each other. We're just super excited.
The Wassmuth Center focuses on human rights through education and conversations. This new space will create more opportunities with the classroom, library, and community spaces.
We hope that this is a space that people will feel welcome to come in wherever they are on their journey of learning, and we hope that people will, of course, come away with more either information and inspiration, but that can lead to some kind of informed action in their life.
The intricate art helps tell a story throughout the building, but it's the opportunity to engage with the stories of the past that make this special exhibit so powerful.
One of the spaces in the building, we feature technology called Dimensions and Testimony that was developed by the USC Shoah Foundation. And the goal of the foundation is really to find a way to meaningfully record as many stories of Holocaust survivors and liberators.
My name is Pinchas Guter. I was born in 1932.
Here you can speak with survivors of the Holocaust, ask them questions, hear firsthand experiences like living as a Jew in the ghettos of 1940s Europe.
That's a space, even though the work we do is not just specific to the Holocaust, it is the one space in our building really dedicated to that, because that, that era remains such a powerful example and something that we continue to learn from, and I think is something that we shouldn't forget.
In the depth of it, I mean, it's not just surface level details.
No, yeah, they really do go into their stories, and some of it is, can be hard to hear.
The conditions were so bad.
There will be a day when survivors of the Holocaust have all passed on.
Apocalyptic inferno.
Technology like this keeps their stories of heartbreak and triumph alive forever.
Were you able to recapture your Jewish identity?
Practicing Judaism gives me a fulfillment that I don't think I would have been able to survive the post-Holocaust without my fervent belief as being a Jew.
Well, the community is invited to join the grand opening of the Wassmuth Center's Phil Batt Education Building. That is tomorrow at 5:30, well, about 15 minutes from now, tomorrow. The new building stands just a few steps away from the Anne Frank Memorial at the south end of 8th Street in downtown Boise, right behind Boise's Library. And beginning Friday, the building will be open Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. Idaho libraries have been getting a lot of attention the last several years because of the books they have stacked on their shelves. The Gem State, just one of the hot spots for the culture wars over, quote, obscenity supposedly available to children because of books in the children's section, most of which had to do with LGBTQ plus themes, by the way. Last legislative session, Idaho put the harmful materials bill into practice after 3 years of trying, meaning if someone complained about an inappropriate book being in the children's section or young adult section of a library, that library had 60 days to review it and determine if that book should be reshelved in another part of the library. If that library board decided to keep it where it is, well, they could be sued for $250 plus damages. Well, Eagle Library just reviewed its first wave of books submitted for reconsideration, 25 of them, in fact. Aspen Shumpert stopped by the library to find out how the board came to the conclusion to move all of them.
The Eagle Library has received considerations for 25 books to be relocated. Mary DeWalt, who sits on the Idaho Library Association, says that's the highest number in the state.
That's our understanding, is they are the one with the most.
Last month, in a closed conversation, the Eagle Library Board discussed those books.
How often is it checked out? Is this something that's really popular, or is this something that is very obscure? It's hidden somewhere and nobody ever sees it. And then also book reviews. You know, some of the mainstream reviewers, what did they say about that?
Only 4 of the complaint documents gave examples and reasons for relocation. The others just listed the book titles.
I did appreciate the ones where they explicitly wrote out, this is why I think the book should be moved.
The board ultimately voted to move 22 books to the adult section of the library.
One that kept coming up was these a series of young adult fantasy books by Sarah Moss, which are exceedingly popular. They're high circulation out of this library. Reading some of the excerpts, they did have, pretty explicit, graphic situations.
3 books were taken off the shelf and put behind the counter. Visitors now need to ask to check those books out.
They left kind of a dummy there, a dummy book, empty book, kind of like they do with games and CDs and DVDs sometimes.
DeWalt says she has some concerns about transparency, like, for example, who exactly submitted complaints. Allman says the Eagle City attorney decided to redact them.
There is an important element, for example, of perhaps if you're going to redact some of the information, at least leave one piece, like maybe a first name, so that someone who's examining the records can tell whether a particular item was challenged by one person or 5 different people.
21 complaints were submitted just in one day.
Well, I can't specifically speak to the people who made the specific complaints, but I would guess if there was a lot of them on one day that it's likely that there are members of the community who were watching for when the law went into effect.
Allman says the city attorney also decided to have the closed-door meeting.
There are everything, any kind of business conducted by the board generally does need to be conducted in a public forum. And there is one exception for potential litigation if the library or entity is about to be sued or has the potential.
Like if the library doesn't remove books within 60 days of receiving a complaint, which was the case for 4 of the books submitted.
Was there reason why those weren't evaluated before those 60 days were up?
Typically we have meetings on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. And it was just the timing of things. We ended up missing one meeting. There wasn't a quorum because various members had personal issues they had to take care of. So we decided to just handle them all at the following meeting. Hopefully whichever person submitted those will give us some grace there.
Allman says another aspect the board is looking into is tiered library cards that parents can enroll their child in, which would limit what they can check out per decision of the parent. The board is hoping to have a proposal of that idea in front of them on next board meeting.
It's interesting that Brian Allman was appointed to the Eagle Library Board on the condition that he wanted to, quote, clean up the library. And he said that the LGBTQ books, he says they're normalizing their lifestyles and fetishes. That's what he was quoted as saying going into that. So I guess they're doing their thing.
They are.
All right. Thank you very much, Aspen. All right, talking about the open primaries initiative, we had a lot of people say, yeah, we know that a lot of people moved over to the R part of the ballot just because they wanted to have a say, like this one. Mark P. in Boise. I registered as a Republican while holding my nose just to have a say. I know many independents and Democrats that have done the same, so it's not something new. If the initiative passes, I've heard the Republican Party will overturn or amend it. Do you know if there's any truth to this? Asks John. There's always that option. They did it with term limits back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, yeah, lawmakers could overturn it if Prop 1 passes. I was an election senior judge in 2011 when ours closed the primary. I served a very conservative precinct. Voters were furious about having to affiliate. Furious. It did not surprise me Prop 1 received such bipartisan support, says Tam in Canyon County. We'll go again tomorrow. See you then.
Continue with us and watch free now on the KTVB Plus app everywhere you stream.